The day a royal guard taught a judge the law. Judge Alastair Merriweather was a man who wore his authority like a second skin. Tall, neatly dressed, and always carrying a small leather folder under his arm, he walked like someone who had never doubted a decision in his life. His silver-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and his sharp eyes missed nothing. People said he could make a courtroom go silent with just one look, and they weren't exaggerating. For nearly 3 decades, Judge Merriweather had ruled from his high seat in one of London's most respected courtrooms. Lawyers whispered his name with a mix of fear and respect. Some called him the hammer in a wig, though never to his face. He wasn't loud or aggressive, but there was a weight to every word he said. Once he made a ruling, that was it. No second chances, no room for error. He believed in the law with a passion. Not just the big parts of it, the crimes and the court battles, but also the fine details, rules, codes, traditions, even the old laws written centuries ago. He had read them all. He respected the law more than anything. To him, the law was not just something people followed. It was a system that held society together. It was sacred. On a quiet Tuesday morning in early autumn, the judge prepared for a visit to Buckingham Palace. It wasn't a court matter, not really. It was a ceremonial visit, something the judges of his rank were invited to every few years. The invitation had come in the mail with a gold-embossed seal. Most judges looked forward to it. A walk through the palace grounds, a polite tea with some members of the royal staff, maybe even a word with a duke or duchess. Just tradition, nothing complicated. Judge Merriweather, however, didn't care for the pomp and pageantry. To him, the law was more important than ceremonies. Still, he respected tradition, and so he planned to go. He would make it quick, in and out. He would show his face, smile politely, shake a few hands, and return to his chambers where the real work waited. Case files, legal documents, and the next hearing he needed to prepare for. He dressed carefully that morning. His black judicial robe was neatly pressed, and the white collar around his neck was starched and perfect. His shoes, polished to a mirror-like shine, tapped softly on the pavement as he walked. His assistant had offered him a car, but Judge Merriweather preferred walking the last few blocks. It helped him think. It reminded him of simpler times when he was just a young lawyer climbing the steps of the courthouse. As he approached the tall gates of Buckingham Palace, he nodded at the few tourists nearby. Some turned their heads, noticing the judge's robe and his formal manner, wondering if he was someone important. He didn't stop to explain. He wasn't one for small talk, especially not with strangers. The palace loomed ahead, its walls high and proud, its flags waving gently in the soft morning wind. He stepped toward the main entrance, where 2 royal guards stood motionless. Their red coats and tall black bearskin hats made them look like statues. But one of them, a young man with calm eyes and a strong posture, stepped forward as the judge arrived. "Good morning, sir," the guard said, his tone respectful but firm. "May I see your entry confirmation, please?" Judge Merriweather raised an eyebrow. "I am here for the judicial visit. The Lord Chancellor's office sent word ahead," he replied, expecting the guard to step aside. The guard remained still. "Yes, sir, I understand. But all visitors must be on the security schedule, and I don't see your name listed for today." The judge adjusted his glasses. "I am not a visitor. I am a judge of the High Court. My name is known. This is a formal appearance. You are mistaken." The young guard didn't flinch. "I respect that, sir, but we have strict entry procedures. Without a confirmed appointment on record for today, I cannot allow entry." Judge Merriweather was surprised. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone so young. Most people stepped back when he spoke in that tone, but this guard was different. He wasn't rude or dismissive. He was simply following a rule, and he was doing it with perfect calm. "I suggest you double-check," the judge said, his voice still even but slightly colder now. "Because I am not in the mood for delays." The guard nodded once, took a small tablet from his belt, and began to scroll through it. The judge waited, trying not to show his impatience. He could feel the curious eyes of nearby tourists watching. He didn't like being questioned, especially in public. After a moment, the guard looked up. "I'm sorry, sir, still no record. You may need to check with the Royal Appointments Office." Judge Merriweather's face tightened. "I do not check, I arrive. I do not seek permission for appointments that are ceremonial in nature." The guard remained calm. "I understand, sir, but the policy changed recently. Even ceremonial visits require confirmation due to new security measures." The judge frowned. He hadn't heard of any such change, and he was someone who kept up with laws and official policies. But here he was being turned away at the gates of the palace by a young man quoting unseen rules. "This is absurd," he said, his voice still quiet but more intense. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, sir, and I mean no disrespect, but I also know my duty. Without the proper clearance, no one passes, not even a high court judge." There was a pause. The judge looked directly at the guard. And for the first time in many years, he found himself at a loss. The law he knew so well did not seem to apply here, or at least not in the way he thought. He could have demanded to speak to someone higher. He could have made calls, raised his voice, or quoted laws. But something in the young guard's steady gaze made him pause. This wasn't a power play. The guard wasn't trying to win. He was just doing his job, just as the judge had done his for 30 years. Judge Merriweather took a breath, stepped back, and nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll make the call." The guard gave a respectful nod. "Thank you for your understanding, sir." The judge walked away, his steps slower now. He wasn't angry, just thoughtful. As he took out his phone and called his assistant to sort out the mix-up, he kept glancing back at the gate. There was something different about this morning, something he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, someone had enforced a rule on him, and done so with such quiet strength that he couldn't help but admire it. He didn't know it yet, but this small exchange would stay with him. It would sit in his mind like a pebble in his shoe, something he couldn't ignore, not because of pride, but because of the strange feeling it gave him. A feeling he hadn't had in years. The law wasn't just what he knew. It was also what others protected, even when no one was watching. The morning air had begun to warm as Judge Alastair Merriweather waited on a nearby bench, just outside the palace gates. His assistant, Miss Clara Dunstable, was on the other end of the phone line, assuring him she'd get everything sorted out within minutes. She was good at handling problems, efficient, precise, much like the judge himself. Still, Judge Merriweather couldn't help feeling uneasy. He had been stopped at a gate he had passed through without question years before. It wasn't the delay that bothered him most. It was the idea that someone had told him no and made it stick. He glanced back at the guard who had stopped him, Lance Corporal Thomas Edivane, according to the small nameplate on his chest. The young man hadn't moved. He stood straight, eyes ahead, the very picture of discipline. His expression didn't show pride or smugness, just focus. "Duty," the judge adjusted his robe and sighed quietly. In all his years dealing with legal arguments, protests, and courtroom tensions, he had rarely come across someone so calm in the face of authority. Most people, especially young ones, backed down once they realized who they were speaking to. They'd become nervous, uncertain. They'd apologize quickly and look for a way to fix the situation. But not this guard. He had stood his ground, not rudely, not loudly, but with complete confidence. It was unusual. Clara called back within 10 minutes. "Sir," she said gently, "there was a mistake with the scheduling team. Your visit was approved but never entered into the palace's updated registry." "That's why your name wasn't there." Merriweather's lips tightened. "So I was right." "Yes, sir," Clara said carefully, "but so was the guard. There are new policies, very strict ones. Everyone must be on the list, even judges." He thanked her and ended the call. Still seated, the judge took a slow breath. He wasn't used to being wrong. Even when others made the error, he often found some way to remain untouched by it. But this time was different. He had arrived without confirmation. The rules had changed, and he hadn't known. More importantly, the young guard had known, and had upheld those rules with clarity and respect. A few minutes later, after Clara had spoken directly with the Royal Appointments Office, Merriweather's name was re-added to the registry. A palace staff member dressed in a formal black suit approached from the gate. "Judge Merriweather," the man asked, bowing slightly, "we apologize for the delay. You're cleared for entry now." The judge stood and adjusted his collar. He nodded politely, but before following the staff member, he looked once more at the young guard. "Lance Corporal Edivane, wasn't it?" he asked. The guard turned slightly, careful to remain professional. "Yes, sir." "I owe you an apology," Merriweather said. "You were doing your duty. You followed the rule even when it was difficult. Not everyone does that." Edivane gave a respectful nod. "Thank you, sir. I was only doing what we're trained to do." "That much is clear," the judge replied. "You do it well." With that, he walked through the palace gates, guided by the waiting staff member. But the exchange stayed with him. It wasn't just about being delayed or corrected. It was something deeper, a lesson in humility wrapped in a few quiet minutes at a gate. Inside the palace, the mood was entirely different. Grand halls, shining floors, tall ceilings with golden trim, everything spoke of tradition and grace. Judge Merriweather was greeted by senior members of the palace staff, offered refreshments, and taken through the scheduled tour. It was all very proper, very dignified, but the judge found his mind wandering back to the gate. While the staff spoke of royal history and upcoming state functions, he kept thinking about the moment someone had used the law to stop him, not out of disrespect, but out of pure responsibility. For years, he had been the one upholding the law, the one pointing out where others had fallen short. But that morning, he had been the one to forget a rule, and someone else had reminded him of it, not with pride, but with professionalism. Later that day, after the visit had ended and he had returned to his chambers, Judge Merriweather found himself pulling out a legal notebook. He jotted down a few lines, something he hadn't done in a while. "It is not the power of the law that keeps society in order. It is the people who honor it, even when no one watches." He paused, tapping the pen against the edge of the table. Then he added, "Today I was reminded that the law lives not only in courts and books, but also in the hearts of those trusted to guard it." That evening, he asked Clara to do some quiet research. "I want to know more about that young guard," he said. "Where he trained, how long he served." "That sort of thing?" Clara was surprised by the request, but she nodded. 2 days later, she returned with the information. "Lance Corporal Thomas Edivane," she read from her tablet. 24 years old, joined the Royal Guards at 19. Studied political science before enlisting. He's received several notes of commendation for alertness and composure. No reported errors in duty. "Political science?" Merriweather asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, sir," Clara replied. "He studied law modules as well, mostly constitutional topics. Seems he has a strong interest in how rules shape institutions." The judge leaned back in his chair. That explained a lot. He looked at the list of commendations. Not once had Edivane broken protocol or caused confusion. He was respected even among more senior guards. "And he's never been in a courtroom?" Merriweather asked. "Not that I can find, sir," Clara said. "But would you like to invite him to observe one?" Merriweather thought for a moment. "Yes," he said finally, "I would." He wrote the letter himself, something he rarely did. It was short and clear, inviting Lance Corporal Edivane to attend a high court session as a guest observer. "No formality required," he added at the end. "Just curiosity and conversation." The letter was delivered the next morning. To his surprise, a reply arrived by the end of the day. It was handwritten neatly with careful spelling and grammar. "Sir, I have long admired the structure and thought behind court procedures, and the chance to observe one firsthand is something I never expected. With respect." The visit would happen the following week. And for the first time in many months, the judge looked forward to a courtroom session, not for the case itself, but for what it would represent. A full-circle moment where two people, from very different walks of life, met at the crossing point of respect, duty, and the law. What had begun as a simple gatekeeping exchange was slowly turning into a story Merriweather would carry with him for years. It was, he realized, not about who was more important, but about who remembered that the law belongs to everyone, not just those who sit above it. The following week arrived with gray skies and a soft drizzle. It was the kind of London morning where the city looked like it had been painted in shades of silver. Judge Alastair Merriweather stood by the tall windows of his chambers, looking out at the wet streets, deep in thought. The courtroom was already prepared for the day's session. A civil case involving a property dispute was scheduled. It wasn't expected to be particularly exciting, but the judge found himself paying extra attention to every detail that morning. Today wasn't just about the case. It was the day Lance Corporal Thomas Edivane was coming to observe. The young guard had accepted the invitation with genuine humility. In his letter, he had said he never imagined he would be allowed inside one of the high courts, let alone as a guest of a sitting judge. There had been no pride in his words, only respect and a quiet curiosity. Judge Merriweather had arranged for a special seat in the observation area, not front and center, but placed carefully where the young man could see and hear everything. A clerk had been assigned to guide him and answer any questions he might have after the session. At exactly 9:45 a.m., the guard arrived. He was no longer in his bright red uniform or tall hat. Instead, he wore a simple navy blue suit, neatly pressed, with a white shirt and plain tie. He carried himself with the same calm confidence the judge remembered. He greeted the staff politely and took his seat without drawing attention to himself. The judge, now dressed in his robes, entered the courtroom moments later. He didn't look at the guest directly, but he knew he was there. He could feel it, the quiet meeting of two worlds. As the court clerk called the room to order, Judge Merriweather took his seat and opened the session. The case began. Two lawyers presented their arguments in turn. It was a dispute over a piece of inherited land. One family claimed it had belonged to them for generations. The other had documents showing a legal sale. Both sides were calm, but their words carried weight. Lives were affected by what would be decided here. From the corner of his eye, the judge could see Thomas listening attentively. He was not fidgeting, not distracted. His eyes followed each lawyer. He looked at the documents, the witnesses, even the body language. He wasn't just watching, he was studying. The session lasted almost 2 hours. When it ended, Judge Merriweather stood, gave the formal closing remarks, and exited through the side door. His clerk met him in the hallway, followed by Thomas. The judge nodded to the young man. "Walk with me," he said. They walked side by side through the quiet corridor of the courthouse. The walls were lined with portraits of past judges, all in black robes and powdered wigs, staring down with serious faces. "I trust the session met your expectations," the judge said. "It was more than I expected," Thomas replied with a small smile. "I've read about court procedures before, but seeing them in action is very different. The balance, the calm, the structure, it all matters." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, structure is the spine of the law. Without it, everything else falls." They turned a corner and entered a small private meeting room. It was simple but elegant, with bookshelves on one wall and a small table in the center. "I want to ask you something," the judge said, motioning for Thomas to sit. "That morning at the gate, you stood your ground, calmly, completely. You didn't hesitate even when I spoke to you with authority. Why?" Thomas considered the question for a moment. "Because the rule didn't change based on who stood in front of me," he said. "Our training is clear. Rules protect everyone equally. If we start making exceptions, even small ones, it weakens the whole system." The judge listened carefully. These were not just memorized lines. The young man believed what he said. "I spent my career thinking the same," the judge said. "But it's easy to forget that belief when you're always the one giving the orders. That morning you reminded me, gently but firmly, that the law is larger than any one person." Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he added, "I didn't think I was teaching a lesson, I just didn't want to break the rules." "Sometimes," the judge replied, "that's how the best lessons are taught." They sat in silence for a few seconds. The judge reached for a small notebook on the table and opened it. "I've been doing some reading," he said, "about the updated security protocols you mentioned that day. They were passed just last year, yes?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "After a small breach during a public event, there was a complete review. The changes were made quietly, but we were trained on them thoroughly." "I missed that update," the judge admitted. "It wasn't part of our usual legal review packets, but I should have known. I pride myself on knowing everything connected to law and order. I was too focused on the courtroom and not enough on the world around it." Thomas looked surprised by the honesty. Judges, in his mind, were always sure, always right. But here was one admitting a mistake, not angrily, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "I suppose we both do the same thing," the judge continued. "You protect the crown's grounds, I protect the law's ground, and both only stay strong if we guard every inch, even the parts people forget." Thomas smiled. "That's one way to put it, sir." The judge closed the notebook and stood. "I'm glad you came today. I hope you'll come again, maybe sit in on a few more sessions if time allows." "I'd be honored, sir," Thomas said, rising as well. "I never thought I'd find myself interested in courtrooms. But now it feels connected, like a different side of the same coin." "That's because it is," the judge said. "Discipline, order, fairness, they aren't owned by one profession, they're shared." They walked back through the hallway in silence for a few minutes. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the light from the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds. Before they parted ways at the courthouse steps, Judge Merriweather turned to Thomas and said, "Let me ask you one more thing. Have you ever thought about studying the law formally?" Thomas paused. "Sometimes I've thought about it, but I always thought it was for people who, well, came from different paths." The judge shook his head. Law doesn't care where you started, it only cares how you carry it. If you ever decide to study it, you'd have a place, I'm sure of it. Thomas looked down, almost embarrassed but deeply grateful. Thank you, sir, that means a lot. They shook hands, and the judge watched as the young man walked away, his stride strong, his posture straight, just as it had been that day at the palace gate. Only now Judge Merriweather saw not just a guard, but a future student of law, perhaps even a future leader. Someone who understood that rules matter, not because they are written, but because they are lived. And in that moment, the judge realized something very important. The strength of the law is not measured in the size of the courtroom, but in the quiet courage of those who follow it everywhere. The following week passed quietly, but something had changed inside Judge Merriweather. His courtroom was the same, the rules were the same, and the people still stood when he entered. Yet, deep down, the judge himself was not quite the same. He kept thinking about his meeting with Lance Corporal Thomas Edivane. He thought about the way the young guard had spoken, the calm strength behind his words, and how he had upheld a rule even when faced with someone older and more powerful. It wasn't just the action that stayed with the judge, it was the spirit behind it. Judge Merriweather had always believed in the law as something grand and high, something kept alive by tradition and logic. But now he had started to see it in a slightly different way. The law was also quiet. It was found in simple things, in a guard's refusal to bend a rule, in a kind word, in a respectful correction. And that thought led to something else. One evening, as the judge sat in his study, sipping a warm cup of tea, he opened a folder of old speeches and notes. These were things he had written over the years for various events, guest lectures, ceremonies, conferences. Most of them were strong, confident words meant to inspire others about the greatness of law. But as he read through them now, they seemed distant. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. This speech, he decided, would be different. It was for a talk he had been invited to give at a legal education seminar for young barristers and law students. The title he had been given was, "The Purpose of Law in a Changing World." Usually he would quote long-standing legal scholars or recite clever lines from centuries-old rulings, but not this time. Instead, he began with a story. "Last week I stood outside the gates of Buckingham Palace," he wrote. "Not as a judge, but as a visitor. I believed I had every right to enter. But a young guard, no older than many of you, stopped me, not with pride or arrogance, but with firm and quiet respect. He explained a rule I had not known, a new policy, a small thing perhaps, but he knew it. He followed it. He honored it even when I did not. In that moment, I was reminded of something important. The law is not just written in books or spoken in courtrooms. It lives in the hands and hearts of ordinary people who believe in fairness and order. That young guard taught me something that day, not because he tried to, but because he stood by what he knew was right." The judge paused. He smiled slightly as he put the pen down. It had been years since he'd written something that felt so honest. The seminar would be in 3 days. He planned to deliver the speech himself, without notes, without polish, just truth. But before that day came, something unexpected happened. One morning, as the judge arrived early at the courthouse, he found a small envelope on his desk. It was addressed to him by hand. Inside was a short letter. "Dear Sir, I've started the application process to study law next term. I never saw myself on that path until our meeting, but now it feels possible. I will still serve proudly as a guard, but I hope to one day serve justice in another way as well, with deep respect." Judge Merriweather read the letter twice, then a third time. There was no proud announcement, no dramatic language, just a quiet decision from a young man who had been moved by a conversation. The judge folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer where he kept his most personal papers. He didn't say anything about it to anyone, not even Clara, his assistant. But inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. On the day of the seminar, the judge stood before a room filled with young legal minds. Students, junior barristers, even some professors filled the hall. They expected to hear about history, structure, and perhaps a few powerful quotes. Instead, they got something far simpler and much more human. The judge told the story of the palace gate. He told it clearly, without naming the young guard, but describing the lesson he had learned. At first, the room was very quiet. Then, as the story unfolded, a warm silence took over, the kind of silence that comes when people are truly listening. He ended his talk with a single thought. "Always remember, It is easy to obey the law when it serves us. It is harder when it challenges us. But that is when it matters most. The room broke into quiet applause, more than polite, but not loud or rushed. It was the kind of applause that said, "You've given us something real to think about." Afterwards, several students came up to speak with him. Some asked about the details of the story. Others simply said thank you. But one young man, not more than 20, asked a question that made the judge pause. "Sir," the student said, "do you think one moment like that can really change someone's life?" Judge Merriweather looked at him, and for a moment he didn't speak. Then he said, "Yes, not only someone else's, but your own." That evening he returned to his chambers and took out Thomas's letter once more. He reread it, this time smiling a little more deeply. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just reaching its most important chapter. A few days later, the judge received word that Thomas's application had been accepted by a respected evening law program. It allowed working professionals to study part-time, and the palace had granted him approval to attend his classes around his duty schedule. Merriweather didn't say much, but he did send a small note in return. "Well done. The law will be better with you in it." Months passed. Seasons changed. The court saw new cases. The judge continued his work, but now with a slightly softer tone. He still ruled fairly, still expected excellence. But there was a new lightness in his voice, especially when dealing with young lawyers or clerks. He even began holding short mentorship sessions, something he had never done before. He didn't make speeches, he told stories, and one story in particular always came up. He called it, "The Day I Was Reminded Why the Law Matters," and each time he told it, the room went quiet. Not because it was grand or full of drama, but because it was real. It reminded people that the law wasn't just about rules. It was about respect, courage, and the quiet moments that shape who we become. A year had passed since Judge Alastair Merriweather had stood at the palace gate and been turned away by a young royal guard named Thomas Edivane. But that single morning had shaped more than just a memory. It had quietly transformed two lives, leading them down new paths neither of them had expected. Judge Merriweather was no longer just known for his wisdom in law or his sharp rulings. People in the legal world began to speak of something else, a change in his tone, a warmth in his teaching, and a new way of seeing things. He was still firm, still fair, but there was something more personal in the way he carried himself now. He had become a mentor, not just a judge. He had started to meet with young students and junior lawyers more often. At first, these meetings were small, once a month, just a handful of curious minds, but word spread. Young people felt that Judge Merriweather wasn't just sharing facts. He was sharing truth, the kind that could guide a whole career. He didn't talk about power or fame. He spoke about duty, clarity, and the importance of listening. And whenever he felt the time was right, he told the story of a quiet morning, a missing name on a list, and a guard who stood his ground. He never mentioned Thomas by name in public. Not because he wanted to hide him, but because he believed the lesson was bigger than just one person. Still, those who were closest to him knew exactly who the story was about. And quietly they admired both men, the experienced judge who had allowed himself to be taught, and the young guard who had taught without trying to. Meanwhile, Thomas Edivane was walking his own new path. Though he continued to serve with pride as a royal guard, he had also started studying law in the evenings. His days were filled with duty and order, while his nights became full of books, lectures, and long hours of reading. At first, it was difficult. The language of law was complex, and the topics sometimes overwhelming. But Thomas approached it the same way he approached everything else, with patience, discipline, and quiet strength. He wasn't the loudest in class, but he asked thoughtful questions. He wasn't the fastest, but he never missed a step. Some of his fellow students were surprised when they found out he was a full-time guard. "How do you do both?" they asked. Thomas would simply smile and reply, "One teaches me structure, the other teaches me purpose." Together, they help me understand justice. Occasionally, Thomas and Judge Merriweather would exchange brief notes. The judge would send encouragement, sometimes along with a book or article to help with Thomas's studies. Thomas always replied with gratitude and updates. Their letters were short but meaningful, like small bridges between two strong minds. Then came the day that brought everything full circle. It was spring again. The trees in London were beginning to bloom and the parks were filled with color. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Judge Merriweather received a formal letter, stamped and sealed. It was from the Legal Training Institute Thomas attended. Inside, the letter read, "We are pleased to inform you that Lance Corporal Thomas Edivane has successfully completed his foundation year in legal studies with distinction. In recognition of his exceptional performance and dedication, we have invited him to speak at the upcoming student recognition ceremony. He has expressed a desire to invite you personally." Attached was a handwritten note from Thomas. "Dear Sir, I wanted to thank you again, not just for your encouragement, but for seeing something in me before I saw it in myself. I would be honored if you would attend the ceremony. It would mean a great deal to me to know that the person who inspired this journey is present as I take this next step. With deepest respect." He turned the envelope over in his hands and then looked out the window at the courtyard below. He remembered the boyish face beneath the tall bearskin hat, the quiet voice, the firm refusal at the palace gate. And now that same young man was standing behind a new kind of gate, the beginning of a life in law. The judge arrived at the ceremony early. He took a seat near the back, not wishing to be noticed. He wasn't there as a guest of honor. He was there as a witness to something beautiful, growth, purpose, and the passing of a quiet torch. When Thomas walked onto the stage, he wore a simple black suit and held a small note card in his hand. His speech was only 5 minutes long. He didn't speak about greatness or success. He spoke about respect, about duty, and about the moment he realized that even small decisions could shape someone else's future. "I didn't plan to study law," he said, his voice clear and steady. "But one morning, while doing my job, I met someone who reminded me that the law is not just about what you know, but how you live it." He paused, looked out into the crowd, and though he didn't point or name anyone, Judge Merriweather knew the glance was meant for him. "I stand here today not because I knew the path," Thomas said, "but because someone believed I could walk it." The room was silent for a long second. Then applause broke out, not loud and wild, but warm and meaningful. After the ceremony, as the guests filed out and students took photos with their certificates, Thomas made his way through the crowd to find the judge. They met quietly near a row of columns by the side garden. No one else was around. "I'm glad you came," Thomas said. "I wouldn't have missed it," the judge replied. They stood there for a moment, the spring breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers. "You spoke well," the judge added, "and not just with words, with heart," Thomas smiled. "I had a good example," the judge chuckled. "No, you had a good instinct. I just reminded you it was worth listening to." They talked a little longer, about classes, cases, and what came next. Thomas planned to continue his studies part-time while still serving. It wouldn't be easy, but he was used to hard paths. As they parted, the judge offered one final piece of advice. "Never forget where you started," he said, "because it will remind you how far you've come, and it will keep your steps steady even when the road is unclear." Thomas nodded. "I'll remember always." They shook hands, not as guard and judge, not even as student and teacher, but as equals. Two men brought together not by status, but by shared values. And so the story came to rest, not with a grand ending, but with a quiet one. A judge who had spent his life upholding the law found himself learning from a moment he hadn't expected. A guard who once stood silently at the gate now stood at the doorway of a new future, holding not just rules, but understanding. And though their meeting had lasted only minutes, the effect lasted for years. Because sometimes the greatest lessons are not shouted, they are lived. And sometimes a single day can change the shape of a life, not because of what was lost, but because of what was found: respect, purpose, and the true meaning of the law.